the great conservative movement of America and of our time. A brush fire of freedom that's being lit all over this country. We, as an irate, tireless American populace, will overcome the few radical leftists that control the levers of power today. Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe, and the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Biggs, Congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District. I'm pleased that you join us today, taking time out of your schedule. It's a little after 11 on the West Coast and in Arizona time, since we don't go to daylight savings time, one of the few rational states in the country not to use daylight savings time. And then on the East Coast, of course, it's 3 hours later, so it's 2 p.m. I have to tell you, I was so excited. I asked Matthew, my guy, if he could get us Peter Schweizer, because he's our guest today, and he is really to me a great hero in America. He is the president of the Government Accountability Institute. He's an investigative journalist, and I encourage you to follow him and read his stuff. He is also an author of 3 number 1 New York Times bestsellers, Red-Handed, Secret Empires, and Profiles in Corruption. These are great books. I give you this compliment. You're a great writer, Peter, but more than just a great writer, he is also a great investigative journalist, where he does the research and he just transmits this, and it's really interesting stuff to read. And we're going to talk about China today. And Peter, I wanted to ask you about where are we? What do you think? Is China truly our number 1 geopolitical adversary today?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Congressman. Thanks for having me on. Yes, absolutely. And it's not me saying that China is our number 1 threat. China acknowledges that. What they have said repeatedly, President Xi, since he came to power, has said that their goal is to supplant the United States on the global stage by 2049. And what he means by that is not only to simply shift the geopolitical balance in terms of military, throw power, et cetera. What he wants to do is fundamentally change the international order. And what he means by that is changing the composition about the way that states and entities operate. So we can have a debate here, but the debate's already been settled in China, and their ambitions are clear. They say it clearly, repeatedly. And I think we owe them the respect of believing actually what they're saying, because there are a lot of activities that demonstrate that is precisely the course that they are on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I want to ask you, news this week, Brazil and China trying to reach an agreement. Maybe they did reach an agreement on use of Chinese currency as a medium of exchange, getting away from the U.S. dollar as standard, which, by the way, and I think if people don't know this, I know you know this, China's been moving that way for literally probably 15 or 20 years. They want to be the international currency of exchange. Peter, how serious is this Brazil-Chinese agreement?
Well, I think it's limited right now, but it sets a really serious precedent, Congressman. And the concern here is that, look, because the United States is sort of the reserve currency of the world, it's the bar upon which all other currencies measure themselves. That gives us enormous influence and power, not only globally, but it simplifies our job when we are running the massive deficits that we run and we're accumulating the national debt that we're running. It gives us enormous flexibility to monetize that debt, to basically push it off, which I think, of course, is atrocious as far as a national policy. But You have more wiggle room when you are sort of the reserve currency of the world. China's goal is to change that. And so what that means is not only that Brazil and other countries will increasingly be using their currency to conduct transactions, but we may very likely reach a point soon, given China's push, to where we are no longer the reserve currency of the world, and that becomes China. And when that happens, it not only complicates life overseas, it will complicate and have a direct impact on our economy and our ability to finance our debt here in the United States. So it's a very, very important deal. It's a limited deal, but I think it moves us in a very perilous direction. And it's a reflection that governments like Brazil, and there are others that are possibly going to move in this direction. It's an indication not only of Chinese strength, but of American weakness under this administration.
Yeah, I think so. Not just our weakness, but certainly the lack of respect for this particular administration, which has the most feckless foreign policy I've seen since, I don't know, Barack Obama's foreign policy. So very interesting. Peter, I'm gonna take China around the globe and try to bring it home as we go. The Belt and Road Initiative by China. We've seen they basically own Sri Lanka now. And you look in Honduras, Honduras withdrawing its recognition of Taiwan as an independent nation. And I think what's the number now? 10 or 11 nations around the world now recognize Taiwan. We don't even recognize Taiwan as a nation anymore. What does that Belt and Road Initiative do to help China further its ambition of becoming the global hegemon?
Well, it accomplishes a couple of things, Congressman. First of all, it helps build out the Chinese economy. The States is a heavy of both energy and food. They're not capable of sustaining themselves in either of those areas. So they are pushing out in areas that are resource rich and agricultural rich. That's really what this is. It's securing their ability to dominate certain sectors of the economy in terms of their own security. That's the first thing that it accomplishes. But the second thing it does is it complicates international markets for the United States. Look what's happening right now with the war in Russia. China is working very, very aggressively, putting leverage on companies not to go along with policies related to sanctions or restrictions on trade with China. They can do that because they have the economic muscle with some of these countries through the Road Initiative. So it limits our ability to sort of rally people around the world to accomplish what I would argue are good American foreign policy goals. So again, this is not something that's happening in the distant developing world where people can shrug their shoulders and say, who cares? This has a very real implication for the flow of energy, the flow of food, and other important items around the world. And then finally, to your point, there is the geopolitical implication. And that is, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union talked about the correlation of forces, which was sort of the accumulation of the military, economic, and political power that each side had relative around the world. It helps shift the correlation of forces because now you have countries in Africa, for example, that tended to be a little bit more pro-US and pro-Western that are now starting to line up with China on some of these international issues. And they're doing it, I think, quite opportunistically because China is, providing economic development and bank credits, et cetera, that are beneficial to themselves. So it has very real implications for us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I love the analysis because it's thorough. I mean, you hit three areas that I think most people probably aren't going to be aware of. I mean, we see the immediate geopolitical imperatives, but we don't typically pay attention to the trade situation that actually benefits China going back with resources, and that's really important to get to. So I want to now move as we continue to view this internationally. I want to go to Taiwan, and I know that we just did a wargaming exercise at the Republican conference just a week. I think it was just last week or so, maybe 2 weeks ago. I can't remember. It just kind of stuff blend in. But the line was they were anticipating a China invasion of Taiwan militarily, and I have said that is possible. I do believe that's possible. It just depends on what Xi thinks is the imperative for him, and which is kind of a pride hegemon. I mean, China has always viewed itself as the center of the universe. That's why the character for China means inside, or the interior, the heart, the core. So, but I think there's another. I'm going to take a contrarian point of view and just bring it. And I want your opinion, Peter. China has already reintegrated Taiwan so much that Taiwan, except for its political system, which the Kuomintang is holding on by a thread there, actually in Taiwan, is already effectively reintegrated. You have 3 million Taiwanese in mainland China. You got 1 million mainland Chinese in Taiwan. You've got a massive amount, depending on who's telling you, 30, 40, 50% of the GDP of Taiwan is a direct tie with mainland China. You've got incredible communication and transit back and forth between people in both countries. And culturally, they're very similar. And I was just talking to a Taiwanese friend of mine this morning, and I was rolling this by him. And he says, yeah, you're absolutely. He thought I was correct. He said the only thing that's different is right now is the political system of Taiwan is outside of China, but it's still subject to influence. So I wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a really important point. I mean, look, you don't quite know when national leaders, particularly those that grow and develop in these kind of autocratic totalitarian systems, the calculations they're going to make. It's kind of a guessing game, but I think you're quite right. Invading Taiwan would be a strategic misstep, not because they wouldn't win the conflict. They would win the conflict, but you have to realize the leading opposition party in Taiwan, and they're barely behind the governing party, is essentially in favor of not complete integration, but basically close cooperation with the CCP in China. So, electoral manipulation, influence operations, which they know they ran in the last several elections, are certainly something that the CCP is going to do. But you also have to look at what has been the sort of strategy of the CCP on the global stage. It has been to not do things that lead to a unified West. This was sort of Deng Xiaoping's advice, which was to bide your time, build your strength and bide your time. And that has been kind of Beijing's strategy. If they were to move into Taiwan, what you would have immediately, I think, is great political and economic unity between the United States, Japan, Australia, Europe, in resisting all sorts of things that China wants right now from the West. They believe if they have access to our capital markets, if they have access to our technology markets, if they essentially have unfettered ability to import goods into the United States with no tariffs, they believe they're going to win. And the evidence is probably, more in their favor than it is in ours. So the question is, why risk that? Why risk a winning strategy by taking a gambit to speed things up in Taiwan? So I tend to agree with you. We need to be cautious. We need to show strength. We need to support Taiwan. I would personally be very surprised if they do move into Taiwan. But of course, we don't know the calculations that political figures in these autocratic regimes make. It's oftentimes a mystery. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. And so as we watch this, then we start talking about how it begins to encircle the U.S. and come to the U.S. And there's indicia of, I'm not sure infiltration is actually too strong of a word, but certainly some kind of movement into the U.S. by the Chinese Communist Party. Do you see such a thing going on? And give us some examples if you do.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. They have a very elaborate approach, which I think is a brilliant strategy. They call elite capture. It's what I wrote about in my book, Red Handed. And it's a problem, as Congressman, you and I have talked about this. It's a problem on both sides of the political aisle. And essentially, what they do is they seek economic alliances that are financially beneficial to American political elites. They seek out commercial relationships with their families. They help make those families wealthy. And in exchange, they're expecting and they receive, I would argue, favorable treatment from those political figures. Now, what they're looking for American elites that they capture is not sort of this robotic repeating CCP talking lines. They know that's not politically viable. The way they define it is they're looking for big help with a little bad mouth. So they understand that a political figure is going to have to criticize them on human rights. They're going to have to ding them for the treatment of the Uyghurs. They might even have to say things about, the theft of intellectual property. The main thing is they want help on the big things that matter to them most, which is essentially unfettered access to capital markets, technology markets, and our commercial markets. And if you play ball with them and you support those areas, they're fine if you criticize them. And this is a problem with both political parties, and it reaches the top levels. I mean, I would argue the first family of the United States right now is a prime example of this elite capture, and it's a very, very hard issue to deal with.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'm looking at stuff. I know we hear a lot about TikTok, but and people are starting to see everything from farming land being bought up by the Chinese, and commercial buildings being bought up by the Chinese, and what you just keep going down that way. And the Hunter Biden thing, I didn't want to get into Hunter Biden too much because I know you know a ton about it, and we continue to investigate. But one thing in your book, I just want to talk about, because when you talk about elite capture, nothing has been driving me crazy over the last 10, 15 years, more than the fact that I view so many of our big corporations to be anti-American and now pro CCP. And so when you look at that and you say, how in the world does some place like Nike come out and say we're now a Chinese company? Peter, what is the proper response for us in dealing with that?
Well, I think the proper response on a personal level should be to shame them and to avoid buying their products. I mean, this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem in Silicon Valley, for example, including, you talk about Nike, you could look at other entities. Just look at Silicon Valley. You've got companies like Microsoft and Google that right now are literally funding AI research in China at laboratories that are known. It's not me saying it, it's not speculating, that are known to be laboratories used by the Chinese military, that they take the research from these AI laboratories to benefit the military capabilities of the Chinese military. And those research laboratories are being funded and manned and supported by Microsoft and Google. It's absolutely ridiculous and absurd. And if you look at some of the political statements that some of those leaders have made, that Elon Musk has made. Elon Musk, of course, has a big factory in Tesla that was built very quickly for the government. They will make statements, favorable to the CCP. They will talk about the efficiency of the dictatorial regime in China, about how it's so easy to get things done in China as opposed to the United States. Well, yeah, if you don't have an independent judiciary, you don't have a separate judicial branch, you don't have an electoral system of government, you don't really have a civic society of private institutions that can protest and raise issues. Yeah, you can be pretty darn efficient. But this is the way that these individuals think. And in exchange, China grants these individuals in Silicon Valley, in the industrial part of America, or on Wall Street, gives them special access to the Chinese market that make them, even richer than they are now. And it's a huge problem. And to me, the only solution is, I'm sure there are legislative ones that you and your colleagues can be working on, but we as Americans need to make clear to them that this is shameful behavior. We should not buy their products, and we should look for ways in which we can continue to try to hold them into account, because they try to obscure this behavior. They say one thing when they're on Chinese state television, they say something else in the United States. We should not allow them to get away with it.
Yeah, you're right, Peter, and I don't want to say treasonous because that would be hyperbolic, but I mean they're effectively laying the groundwork for what I view as our geopolitical adversary. I view China as the biggest international threat we have, and they're effectively not just providing them the structure to get the resources to one day be used against us, but with their investment, they're providing the capital to China that is also going to be used against us and is being used against us today. And that, I mean, you combine those together, it really becomes, some people would say it is treasonous. I don't want to say it's treasonous. I just want to say it is anti-American. It is anti-American.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the term treasonous has a very specific legal term.
Yes.
That is above my pay grade, but it is reprehensible behavior. And it is happening quite a bit with titans of industry. You look at Wall Street, talk about this in the book, the biggest firms, BlackRock, Blackstone, you look at the largest hedge funds in America, Bridgewater Associates. These are all firms that are doing business in China, and they are actually invested in companies that are part of the Chinese military industrial complex. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are involved with a company. They're major shareholders in a company called BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams. I mean, that's wonderful, right? What does BYD do? They do produce automobile components for missile and rocket programs involving the Chinese military. And yet here we have Warren Buffett and Bill Gates as shareholders, investors, major investors in this company. That's just, in my mind, out of bounds behavior. There are probably some things that can be done legislatively in Washington. I'm sure you and your colleagues are looking into that. But again, that should be shameful behavior. They should be asked about this anytime they do a television interview, and they should be confronted about it when they have a shareholder meeting where they're discussing the investment behaviors that they're engaging in.
So let's step back out of the U.S. for just a moment, and let's get to something you just said. When you were developing co-developing guidance systems for missiles in China for the military industrial complex of China, well, it's like our military industrial complex. Missiles, Apache helicopters, you name it, they don't stay just for the U.S. military. We sell them to our collaborative states and our allies. Is China doing that with some of the technology and some of the actual physical components that our U.S. companies are assisting in building? Is China then in turn selling it to their client states like an Iran, like an India? What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, they are. I mean, China recognizes, as the United States has, that one of the ways to offset the costs of some of these advanced technologies is to be able to sell them overseas, certainly to allies. You're not selling them to your adversaries. So yes, that is part of the program. So, the notion that somehow you're going to invest in a technology that has military application that involves the Chinese military, and somehow that's not going to end up being pointed at the United States, either by the PLA in China or by the Iranians or potentially by the Russians or someone else in the developing world, you're being incredibly naive. This is the way that the approach does. And the problem is, in China, under President Xi, you had this very explicit move, which they call civilian military fusion. And the idea is very simple. Any technology that is developed by civilians in China, if it has military application, they are required to provide that technology for the use of the Chinese military. So the examples that I've given, Congressman, have been very specific examples of companies that are already in the military sphere. But let's be clear, if you're invested in any tech company in China, even if they don't currently have military contracts, even if they're not currently doing joint research with the Chinese military, if you're helping them advance their technological capability in an area that has military application, it is going to end up in the hands of the Chinese government because it's required that these companies do it by law. So that's a binary choice we didn't make. That's a binary choice made by the Chinese government. They have now put American companies in the position where they have to make this choice. And the problem is, I'm not very convinced that too many companies are going to make the right choice here. I think they're going to look the other way, take the money, and if it does end off, civilian technology ends up benefiting the military, so be it. They're more concerned about their quarterly profits than they are about the long-term implications of the research they're doing in China.
Yeah, I think that's right. And a lot of people, we think of things like, well, when we think technology, we think in high tech, we're thinking development of software, those types of things. But if we develop in China everything from clothing to movement or transportation, I think that law still applies on all of that because it could be, if it has military application at all, whether it's some kind of special sock or whatever. Guess what? You thought you were making socks to bring back, and if you have a special capacity in those socks, I know it's a crazy thing, but it's just, my point is, it's just anything that has military application. My understanding is that has to go to the military.
Yeah, and you have the added problem. I mean, you make a very important point here. You have the added problem that it benefits the military, but there are also products that maybe don't have military application, but create a strategic opportunity for China to exploit against the United States. So what happened during 2020 with COVID? Obviously, there's a big debate right now about the origins of COVID. That's finally being looked at by Congress, which I think is terrific. But remember what happened in 2020 when the United States started raising questions about the possible origins of COVID. China actually quite explicitly threatened us by saying, well, you know what? We may not ship pharmaceuticals to you anymore. We may stop doing that. So we have to realize that China, meaning the CCP, the Chinese government, views our economic dependency upon them for certain goods, and they can be basic goods like antibiotics. They view that as leverage that can be used as a weapon against us. Whether it's civilian or military, it doesn't matter. It's a strategic item or a strategic good that they view at leverage. And they've already threatened us with that once. They've threatened Australia. They actually limited Australian imports and exports for a while in 2020 for the same reason. They threatened Sweden. When Sweden supported a Chinese political dissident, they threatened economic retaliation on them. So this is a problem. And the old model, Congressman, was, to engage China. For 30, 40 years, we heard greater commerce with China, greater so-called integration would bring a more liberal, a less hostile China. The last 10 years demonstrate the exact opposite has happened. It has emboldened President Xi and his administration, and it has strengthened them, and it has created this leverage that they have over us that they didn't have 25 years ago.
Yeah, as we get close to running out of time, because I do have another question to ask you, but it reminds me of this nation building mantra that the U.S. has had. Let's go into Afghanistan. We're going to build a new nation. We're going to build a new nation in Iraq. We're going to do it in Sudan. We're going to do it in Syria. We engage in these nation building exercises, which is quite frankly an offshoot of the multilateral institutionalists who just believe that you get a multilateral institution that's going to solve problems outside of the Westphalian nation state. And I'll leave all that aside for a second, but it gets to this notion of something you said earlier, and I wanted your comment on it. You talked about naivete, and I want to take it in back home to the Biden administration, because I view the Biden administration, I view the Obama administration the same. I thought the Trump interlude was what I called strategic ambiguity, where they never knew quite what he was going to do. They just knew that it was America first, and he could scare the bejeebies out of them. But this notion in the Biden administration to consistently say, well, if we engage, that's the deal. If we engage people, these nations, well, we're going to be able to be okay with them. But the problem is Xi Jinping, Putin, Kim Jong-un, you just name it. The people that we view as bad guys in the world, are strong authoritarian leaders. They're playing by a realist interpretation of the international system, and China in particular is taking the long road approach, which they've taken literally for 150 years to come back to become the hegemon that they felt like they were abused by the British and the Western colonizers. Anyway, the point being, how do we get our administration to understand that as the multilateral institutions aren't really going to help us that much when the realists will manipulate through those institutions and use regular terms of realism, which is power projection in the international system? How do we get that through to our administration?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. It's a very, very hard task. The first one is what I personally believe, which is you have this financial relationship between the Biden family and certain individuals in China, all of whom happen to be linked to Chinese intelligence, that in my mind raise concerns about corruption, about influence, about that, helping to determine the policy outcry. But set that aside for a minute. You have the added problem that you touched upon of what is sort of the worldview. And Joe Biden and his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, continue to stick with this view that basically China wants to become more like us, that if we continue to engage them, they will become more like us. And think about their policy prescription. Whatever China does is always the same. If China, engages, actually does something good, they say we need to have more engagement. If China does something bad, we need more engagement. It's the same policy prescription every time, and it does not work. China is far more hostile, far more aggressive than they were 15 years ago. At the same time, trade has never been larger between our two countries. So this notion that economic commerce somehow brings about peace, there are a lot of exceptions to it. Remember, of course, at the beginning of the outbreak of World War I, Germany and Great Britain were their largest trading partners for each one, and they ended up going to war. So there's a worldview problem that they have continued to cling to. There are people on both sides of the aisle. And what we need to do, frankly, is show China, the CCP, the respect of taking them seriously, that they see the world differently than we do. And that when they spout the beliefs of, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is how they define their Marxist-Leninist view, they mean it, not to dismiss it and pretend that they're just giving happy talk to legitimize their authority. They actually believe this stuff. We need to show them the respect, and then we need to show the strength in response in realizing that they're not in favor of moving in the same direction, and we need to act accordingly.
Peter, man, this has gone by so fast. I mean, when you talk about China and the issues the multitude of issues that are raised in our relationship with China, and also China's role in the world today, we could probably go on for hours. I remember taking a graduate level course that went on for an entire semester just on an aspect of China. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. We have the great Peter Schweizer with us. Peter, how can they follow? How can my friends follow you on social media?
You can follow me on Twitter at Peter Schweizer. I also have a podcast called The Drill Down, which you can find at thedrilldown.com, or you can subscribe to it wherever you find podcasts. So thank you, Congressman. I enjoyed it. It was great to be with you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And folks, if for the video of the podcast, you can go to at Rep Andy Biggs AZ on Twitter and Instagram, at Rep Andy Biggs on Facebook, Congressman Andy Biggs on Truth, at Rep Andy Biggs AZ, or to the biggs.house.gov, or you can get the audio version of What's the Biggs Idea at either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And I would just tell you, I can't advertise. I'm not advertising, but Peter has written some great books, and I think they're thematically arranged to reflect. Peter, I hope you don't mind me saying this, a kind of a dubious cynicism of American leadership and its interactions with the American people. And I think that's kind of a common thread, at least what I've seen. That's what I take away, Peter, anyway. You may want me to take away something else away. Oh. But ladies and gentlemen, if you get a chance, I would urge you to read those books because they are so insightful.